I never imagined my life could spiral out of control so quickly. It started as an ordinary afternoon, laundry, dishes, and the usual routine. But when Ryan walked in that day, everything changed. He wasn't supposed to be home yet. I thought I had the house to myself, but there he was, standing in the doorway, staring at me. I froze. In my hands was something I should have put away hours ago, a toy bright and unmistakable. My heart pounded. Ryan's eyes lingered on it for a moment before meeting mine. "What's that?" he asked, his voice low, almost teasing. Panic surged through me. "None of your business," I snapped, quickly grabbing a blanket to cover it. My cheeks burned as he smirked and leaned against the doorframe. "You don't have to be embarrassed, Lena," he said casually. "It's not like I haven't seen something like that before." His words made my stomach twist. He was my stepson, barely out of college, and he was looking at me like no stepson should. I stammered something about privacy and told him to leave, but he didn't move. Instead, his gaze shifted, slowly trailing down my body. It should have disgusted me. It should have made me yell at him to get out. But it didn't. Instead, my pulse quickened, and I hated myself for it. Finally, he shrugged. "All right, I'll go," he said, but as he turned to leave, he looked back over his shoulder. That look lingered far too long, and I felt it deep in my chest. For the rest of the evening, I couldn't shake it. I replayed the moment over and over, convincing myself it was just awkwardness, nothing more. But when I caught him watching me at dinner, his eyes lingering as I passed him the salt, I knew I was wrong. This wasn't just awkward. It was dangerous. If you're hooked already, make sure to like the video and subscribe for the rest of this intense and forbidden story. Trust me, it only gets more complicated from here. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay in bed next to Mark, my husband, staring at the ceiling while his steady breaths filled the room. My thoughts wouldn't stop racing. Memories of Ryan's gaze, the smirk that lingered far too long, and the way my body had responded when it shouldn't have. I hated myself for it. Slipping out of bed, I padded into the kitchen for a glass of water, hoping to clear my mind. But as I reached for a glass, I heard soft footsteps behind me. I turned to see Ryan standing there, shirtless, his lean muscles illuminated by the dim light. "You're up late," he said, his voice softer than before but still carrying that edge of confidence. "I could say the same about you," I replied, gripping the glass tighter. He smirked again, stepping closer, his eyes never leaving mine. "Couldn't sleep," he said. "Too much on my mind." I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath. "Like what?" "Like what happened earlier," he said bluntly. "You don't have to act like it didn't happen." I set the glass down with a sharp clink and turned to face him. "Ryan, we can't, whatever you think this is, it's not." He stepped closer, closing the space between us. "You keep saying that," he murmured, his voice low and smooth. "But I see the way you look at me." His words sent a shiver down my spine. I wanted to deny it, to push him away, but my body betrayed me. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear, and I froze. "This is wrong," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Then tell me to stop," he said, his fingers trailing down my arm, leaving a trail of heat in their wake. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. He leaned in closer, his breath warm against my skin. My heart pounded so loud I thought it might drown out the silence of the room. And then, he stepped back. "Good night, Lena," he said, his eyes lingering on mine before he turned and walked away, leaving me trembling and breathless in the kitchen. I pressed my back against the counter, trying to catch my breath. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The next morning, I tried to act normal. I made breakfast, folded laundry, and even managed to laugh at one of Mark's bad jokes. But no matter how much I tried to distract myself, my thoughts kept drifting back to Ryan. The way his touch lingered on my skin, the heat in his voice, and the dangerous look in his eyes. When Ryan finally came downstairs, his hair damp from a shower and his t-shirt clinging just slightly to his chest, I felt my pulse quicken. He greeted Mark casually, but when his eyes met mine, something shifted. I turned away quickly, focusing on scrubbing the already clean countertop. But I could feel his eyes on me, studying me, daring me to look back. "Need help with the dishes?" he asked, stepping closer. "No, I've got it," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. Mark barely noticed the tension, already lost in his crossword puzzle. But Ryan did. He smirked, picking up a towel and leaning against the counter beside me. "We should talk," he said softly, so Mark couldn't hear. "There's nothing to talk about," I whispered back, keeping my eyes on the sink. He leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't tell me to stop last night." I froze, my hands tightening on the sponge. "Ryan, you need to stop this." Stop what? He said, his tone dripping with challenge. Stop wanting you? Stop noticing how lonely you are? How badly you need someone to actually see you? My breath caught. You don't know what you're talking about. He set the towel down and stepped even closer. His hand brushed against mine, deliberate this time. I pulled away, but not before feeling the heat of his touch spreading through me like wildfire. This can't happen, I hissed, turning to face him. Then tell me to leave, he said, his voice steady, his eyes locked on mine. But I couldn't. Instead, Mark cleared his throat behind us, breaking the moment. Ryan stepped back, his expression calm and collected, but his eyes told a different story. And as I watched him walk away, I realized mine probably did too. I told myself I'd avoid him, that I'd put an end to whatever this was before it went too far. But later that afternoon, I found myself alone in the laundry room, folding towels when Ryan appeared in the doorway. I froze, my hands trembling as I tried to focus on the fabric in front of me. Always working, he said, his voice smooth and low. Someone has to, I replied, forcing a casual tone, but my body betrayed me. My pulse raced and my skin felt hot under his gaze. He stepped closer, his presence suddenly overwhelming in the small space. You don't have to do this, you know. Do what? I asked, avoiding his eyes. Pretend like everything's fine. Like you're happy. I swallowed hard, refusing to look at him. Ryan, this is crossing a line. Is it? He said, stepping closer until I could feel his breath against my neck. Or is it the first time someone's made you feel alive in years? I spun around to face him, but the words I wanted to say died on my lips when I saw the look in his eyes. Hungry, determined, and far too certain of what he wanted. Don't, I whispered, even as my back pressed against the counter. His hand came up, brushing my hair back, his fingers lingering against my skin. Tell me you don't want this, he said softly. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. Instead, my breath hitched as his hand slid down my arm, his touch leaving trails of fire in its wake. This is wrong, I said again, my voice trembling. Then stop me, he whispered, leaning closer. But I didn't stop him. Not when his lips brushed against my neck, not when his hands gripped my waist, pulling me closer. And definitely not when my body leaned into his, craving more. The sound of the front door slamming shut broke the spell. We jumped apart, my heart pounding as if it might explode. Mark, I breathed, panic seizing me. Ryan stepped back, his jaw tight, but there was no regret in his eyes. This isn't over, he said, his voice low and sure before walking out. And I knew he was right. I avoided Ryan for the next 2 days. I buried myself in chores, errands, and pretending everything was fine. But the truth gnawed at me. I couldn't erase the feel of his hands, the warmth of his breath, or the way my body had responded without hesitation. I told myself it was a mistake, that I'd let things get out of hand, and it couldn't happen again. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself, I knew I was lying. On the third night, Mark fell asleep early on the couch. Same old routine, same old snoring. I tiptoed into the kitchen, needing space to breathe. And that's when Ryan walked in. His eyes locked on mine the moment he stepped inside, and I knew I was in trouble. Still avoiding me? He asked, his voice low but steady. I'm not avoiding you, I said quickly, though we both knew it was a lie. He smirked, leaning against the counter, his arms crossed. Good, because we need to talk. There's nothing to talk about, I said, trying to step past him. But he caught my wrist, stopping me in my tracks. You don't really believe that. I tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. Not enough to hurt, just enough to make me feel how much he wanted me to stay. Let go, Ryan, I whispered, but my voice lacked conviction. No, he said firmly. Not until you admit what we both know. And what's that? I shot back, my voice shaky. That you feel this too. His words hit me hard, cutting through every excuse and denial I'd been clinging to. And when he stepped closer, pressing me gently against the counter, I didn't fight it. His hand trailed up my arm, over my shoulder, and cupped my face. Tell me to stop, he whispered again. I couldn't. Instead, my breath hitched as he leaned in, his lips brushing mine. It started soft, almost hesitant, but when I didn't pull away, his kiss deepened. My fingers gripped his shirt, pulling him closer, and for those few stolen moments, I let myself forget everything else. Mark, the consequences, the guilt. But the sound of footsteps down the hall shattered the moment. I pushed Ryan away, my chest heaving. You need to go, I hissed. He stepped back, his eyes dark with frustration and something else, desire. This isn't over, he said again before walking out. And this time, I didn't try to convince myself otherwise. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I was teetering on the edge of a cliff. Every glance from Mark, every casual touch of his hand, sent waves of guilt crashing over me. But it wasn't enough to erase what had happened in the kitchen, or how much I wanted it to happen again. I spent most of the day avoiding Ryan, but by evening, I found myself drawn to the back porch, where I knew he liked to sit. Sure enough, he was there, leaning against the railing, a beer in his hand. "You shouldn't be out here," I said softly, stepping outside. He turned to look at me, his eyes calm but unreadable. "And yet here you are." I hated how right he was. I hesitated, then stepped closer. "Ryan, we can't keep doing this." "Doing what?" he asked, his voice steady. "Talking. Being honest about what we feel." I shook my head. "No, this has to stop. It's wrong." His jaw tightened, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of frustration in his eyes. "Why?" "Because someone decided it should be." "No," I said, my voice breaking. "Because I'm married to your father." He set his beer down and closed the distance between us in 2 steps. "You're married to a man who barely notices you anymore," he said. "You deserve more than that." His words hit me harder than I expected because they felt true. Too true. "Stop," I whispered, stepping back, but he followed, not letting me escape this time. "Why?" he said, his voice lower now. "Because it scares you? Or because you want it too much?" Before I could answer, he reached out and brushed his fingers against my cheek, tilting my chin so I had no choice but to meet his eyes. And then he kissed me. This wasn't like before, hesitant and unsure. This time it was hungry, desperate, like we'd both been holding back for far too long. My body betrayed me, leaning into him, my hands sliding up his chest. He backed me up against the railing, his lips trailing down my neck, making my breath hitch. I knew I should stop him, but I couldn't. My fingers tangled in his hair, pulling him closer as his hands gripped my waist. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway snapped us apart. "Mark," I gasped, pushing Ryan away. He stepped back, his eyes still dark and full of fire. "This isn't over," he said, his voice steady. And as I ran inside, my heart racing, I knew he was right. It wasn't over. Not even close. I avoided Ryan for the rest of the evening, but it didn't help. My skin still tingled where his hands had been, and my lips still burned from his kiss. I sat at the dinner table across from Mark, pretending to listen as he talked about work, but my mind was somewhere else, somewhere dangerous. Ryan sat at the far end of the table, quiet but watching me. Every glance he threw my way felt like a challenge, a reminder of how close we had come to losing control. After dinner, I escaped to the bedroom, thinking I'd finally have a moment to breathe. But just as I closed the door, there was a soft knock. I froze. I knew it was him. I opened the door just enough to see his face, and immediately my pulse quickened. "Ryan, you can't be here," I hissed. He didn't listen. He slipped inside, closing the door behind him. "Tell me you didn't feel it," he said, his voice low and rough. "Feel what?" I whispered, backing up until my legs hit the edge of the bed. His eyes locked on mine. "This." And then he was on me, his lips crashing against mine, his hands gripping my waist as he pushed me back onto the mattress. I gasped, but I didn't stop him. My hands reached for him, pulling him closer as his body pressed against mine. His lips moved down my neck, leaving trails of fire on my skin. "This is wrong," I whispered, but even as I said it, my fingers were tangled in his hair, pulling him closer. "Then stop me," he murmured against my skin, but we both knew I wouldn't. His hands slid under my shirt, tracing every curve, making my body shudder. I should have pushed him away. I should have said no. But instead, I arched into him, craving more. The sound of Mark's footsteps in the hallway made us freeze. Ryan pulled away, his breathing heavy, his eyes locked on mine. "I'm not giving up on you," he said before slipping out the door. I collapsed onto the bed, my heart racing. I knew this couldn't continue. But the worst part, I didn't want it to stop. The next morning, I couldn't even look at Mark. Every time he spoke, every time he touched my shoulder or kissed my cheek, guilt clawed at my chest. But beneath the guilt, there was something worse, desire. I told myself to stay away from Ryan, but it didn't matter. He found me later that afternoon, alone in the living room, folding laundry like I always did when I needed a distraction. "Lena," he said softly. I didn't look up. "Ryan, don't." But he didn't listen. He stepped closer until I could feel his presence, his warmth seeping into me. "Look at me," he said, his voice low and commanding. I finally raised my eyes, and the moment our gazes met, I knew I was lost. "You're killing yourself pretending this doesn't mean anything," he said. I shook my head. "It can't mean anything." "Then why do you keep letting me get close?" Before I could answer, he reached out and took my hand, his thumb brushing softly against my skin. My breath hitched as he pulled me toward him. "Ryan, I need you," he said, his voice rough. "And I know you need this too." I should have stopped him. I should have told him to leave, to walk away and never come back. But instead, I let him pull me closer, his lips capturing mine in a kiss that shattered every last piece of resistance I had left. This time, there was no hesitation. No pulling away. His hand slid under my shirt, tracing the curves of my waist as my fingers tangled in his hair, pulling him even closer. We stumbled back against the couch, his body pressing against mine as his lips moved down my neck. I gasped, arching into him, desperate for more even as my mind screamed at me to stop. But there was no stopping this. Not anymore. When the front door opened and Mark's voice called out, we broke apart, breathless and flushed. Ryan stepped back, his jaw tight. "This isn't the end," he said, his eyes locked on mine before disappearing down the hall. And as I stood there, shaking and trying to pull myself together, I knew he was right. It wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something I couldn't control. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt Ryan's hands on me, his lips against my skin. I hated myself for it, but I couldn't stop thinking about him. How alive I felt when he touched me, how badly I wanted more. By morning, I had convinced myself it had to stop. I'd keep my distance, stay out of his way, and focus on Mark, my husband, the man I'd promised to love and honor. But Ryan didn't give me the chance. I was in the guest room, organizing old boxes, when he slipped inside and closed the door behind him. "Ryan, you can't keep doing this," I said, backing up against the wall. "I can't stop," he said, his voice low and raw. "And I don't think you want me to." I shook my head, even as my body betrayed me, my breathing quickening as he stepped closer. "You don't understand what you're doing to me." "Then tell me to leave," he said, reaching out and brushing his fingers down my arm. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. Instead, I closed the distance between us, my lips crashing into his. There was no hesitation this time, no guilt or shame, just heat and hunger. His hands gripped my waist, pulling me against him as my fingers fumbled with the buttons of his shirt. We didn't stop. Not when his lips trailed down my neck, not when his hands slid under my shirt, and definitely not when he backed me up against the bed. I let him take me, completely and without hesitation. It was reckless, dangerous, but in that moment it didn't matter. Nothing mattered except the way he made me feel. Afterward, as we lay tangled together, the reality of what we had done started to sink in. "This can't happen again," I whispered, even as my fingers traced lazy circles on his chest. "You don't mean that," he said, pulling me closer. But I did, because no matter how much I wanted him, I knew we couldn't keep this up. Someone would find out, and when they did, the fallout would destroy everything. Yet, as Ryan's lips found mine again, I knew stopping wouldn't be as easy as I wanted it to be. I told myself it was over, that what happened in the guest room was the last time. But every time I looked at Ryan, I knew I was lying. The way he watched me, hungry, possessive, made it impossible to forget. And worse, I didn't want to. For the next few days, we danced around each other. Tension hung in the air, thick and unspoken, but it was only a matter of time before it exploded again. It happened one evening while Mark was out running errands. I was in the laundry room, folding clothes, when Ryan appeared in the doorway. "Lena," he said, his voice low. I turned, already knowing what was coming. "We can't." He stepped closer. "Then tell me to leave." I didn't. Instead, I let him push me back against the dryer, his lips crashing into mine. Clothes fell to the floor as his hands gripped my hips, pulling me against him. My body responded instantly, arching into him as his lips trailed down my neck. "We're going to get caught," I whispered, even as I tangled my fingers in his hair, pulling him closer. "Then stop me," he murmured against my skin. But I couldn't. The sound of the garage door opening broke us apart, both of us breathless and flushed. Ryan's eyes burned into mine. "I won't lose you," he said firmly. "You never had me," I replied, but we both knew it was a lie. He slipped out just as Mark walked in, oblivious to what had almost happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were running out of time. Later that night, I found a note tucked under my pillow. I meant what I said. "I won't give up on you, no matter what happens." I stared at it, my heart racing. I knew this couldn't end well. Someone would find out, and when they did, it would ruin everything. But as I lay awake, thinking about Ryan, his touch, his words, I realized something terrifying. I didn't want it to end. If you want to know what happens next, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Stay tuned for more stories filled with passion, betrayal, and forbidden romance.